I'm Jared Bowen tonight on Greater Boston. From ChatGPT and job-swallowing robots to deep-fake photos, developments in artificial intelligence are moving at lightning speed, prompting major concerns about not just what AI can do, but what it should do. I'll talk to Harvard professor Danielle Allen, one of more than 1,000 experts calling on an industry-wide pause on AI. Plus, sociologist Michael Jeffries on his new book, which chronicles the challenges of being black and queer on campus. And we'll go into the woods with Tony Award-winning actor Gavin Creel as Broadway comes to Boston. Is it time to pull the plug on artificial intelligence? Advances in AI have brought us some remarkable technological advances in recent years, some with life-saving applications like cancer screenings and climate change tracking. But then there are programs like ChatGPT, which has made headlines for launching into unsettling conversations with users, not to mention racial biases. Now, as AI's darker side comes into focus, a group of science, tech, and ethics experts are calling for a pause on new developments. In an open letter, more than 1,000 industry leaders, including Elon Musk and Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak, write in part, recent months have seen AI labs locked in an out-of-control race to develop and deploy ever more powerful digital minds that no one, not even their creators, can understand, predict, or reliably control. So, the some 1,500 people who have signed the letter already are asking for AI labs to commit to a 6-month pause on all development. The letter continues, if such a pause cannot be enacted quickly, governments should step in and institute a moratorium. I'm joined now by one of the letter's signatories, Danielle Allen, a Harvard professor and director of the university's Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics. Danielle, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here, Jared. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, let's set the stage. First of all, I have not slept for about the last 3 months since I started really diving into this. Set the stage for us. 20 years from now, how are we going to be looking back at this very moment?
That is a great question, and I appreciate your comment about sleeplessness. There's a sense in which, for me, for others who've been in this space, this is kind of like the beginning of COVID again, to be honest. That is, the magnitude is so great, and things are moving so fast that people are trying really hard to figure it out. So I'm glad we're not the only sleepless ones, Jared. I'm sorry that you're in that category too, but you are not alone. I can tell you that. So in terms of how we'll think about it in 20 years, when I have the chance to be talking to technologists about what they say, they use really quite extraordinary metaphors. So, for example, one that I recently heard was somebody said, it's like the invention of fire. So that is the significance that people are crediting to this. And they're right. So I tend to use the metaphors more like the invention of gunpowder or the invention of nuclear power. Nuclear power, rather, sorry. These are both inventions that just changed what human beings could do in fundamental ways. Society changed around those technological developments. So this is really at that scale, and we should all be taking it very seriously.
So take us through the things that are most concerning to you, because we talk about this, and some of it I get has been kind of in joking terms, or terms that we don't seem to be so concerned about, that ChatGPT can write your resume, or it can write your biography, or it can help students cheat on their exams. Not that that's a light subject matter by any means, but what are some of the darker realms that we're facing here with the advancement of this technology?
So what has really happened is just that in the last month, we've seen a sea change in capability. So ChatGPT was one thing, but at the beginning of this month, OpenAI released GPT-4, which is at a whole different level of functionality. So ChatGPT, GPT-3, was able to perform at about sort of, say, the 10th or 25th percentile when you compared it against humans on LSAT or any other number of tests or the kind of work computer coders do. But it can now perform on par with the top professionals, in the field kind of across the board. So what does that mean for workforce, for example? We should probably expect some pretty serious layoffs, even or especially in the tech sector. I mean, that would be one really meaningful near-term impact. By the same token, though, so the person who used the metaphor of fire with me said about it that really, so fire, carbonizes, it takes carbon and, sort of turns it into energy. And what this does is take content and turn it into energy. And what does that mean exactly? It means anybody at this point with a digital footprint can be impersonated. Okay, so ChatGPT has the capability of writing an op-ed in the style of Danielle Allen. I have a column for the Washington Post. It could write columns in my voice, and you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference. And so we are already living in a world that is just drowning in the problem of misinformation. It's about to get worse. That's the really scary thing.
So this letter has gone out. There's no reasonable expectation that this pause will happen. How is the tech world responding to it, especially when OpenAI and other big tech companies have decidedly walked away from this letter and have no intention of signing?
Well, I honestly think that it is time for governments to step up. I think the UN should be involved in this conversation, and that it's actually time for a global convention to establish a pause. And in that regard, I would use the analogy to nuclear power, right? Because the nuclear power was developed by governments in the middle of wartime. So there are all kinds of things we could say, all kinds of things we could critique about how that unfolded. But at the end of the day, there was a sort of pretty rapid period of trying to figure out global conventions for managing this force that had good things it could do. It could provide energy, for example, but then also obviously just existentially destructive things. And so in the same vein, this new technology, generative foundation models, large language learning models and the like, they can do lots of good for us. There's all kinds of ways they can complement and extend human capabilities in the same way that the Hubble telescope helps us see things that our eye can't see. So we want that power and we want to use it, but we really need to figure out how to put guardrails on the potential negative downstream consequences. So it is time for governments to step up and say, hey, tech companies, you don't get to decide this one. We need a pause.
Well, there are many people who point out that the politicians don't understand what's happening, let alone a lot of the people in the country. As we were talking just before we came on, I don't understand why this is buried in the business section of the pages and why this isn't front page news, which is why we're doing it on the top of the show tonight. But if governments around the world don't step forward, what does it mean for the first government or corporate entity that takes this and really manifests it in a huge way?
Yes, well, OpenAI, what they're doing with GPT-4 right now, I think, honestly, we can probably expect the functionality there to begin to be like a utility, something that every single person in the entire world is trying to use in the same way that we use electricity. So for starters, they're going to blow up as a massive company. They're going to make incredible profits. And if they're the sort of sole controller of something that's basically a utility for the entire globe, well, there you have a problem right there. So there's a lot to think about. How does the corporate sector engage here? How do we think about the impacts on politics because of the problem of misinformation, the issues for the workforce and the like? But, you said, why is this buried in the business pages? And I think that's a really important question. The answer is because the corporate sector is what has developed this. It has really been a private sector enterprise. And it is time for us to see that the public consequences are so significant that we need the public sector to step up, catch up, and be ready to help shape and to direct this.
What do we make of the speed of this? I think back to a story that I did at the MIT Museum, I think it was last fall, where I sat down and co-wrote a poem with an AI software. And I thought, well, isn't that cute? It teases out the creative aspect. And here we are 6 months later, and now we're seeing the darker realms, how we see that it has the possibility to disseminate disinformation. It tried to break up one columnist's marriage, but by the darker ways it was rooting around in his life. I mean, there are some very dark places this is going already, and it's far and away beyond what I experienced last fall because of the rapid development. What does this mean that we have to keep up with this pace?
Well, and here's how far it's spreading. My son, my 11-year-old son, a couple of weeks ago, asked me if he could get a $5 a month subscription to a service that would let him impersonate anybody's voice. Okay. And his reason was so that he could call the school and get excused from school using my voice. But, my 11-year-old is already getting the opportunity to take advantage of these technologies for, let's call them, nefarious purposes. So just imagine in the hands of genuinely bad actors where this could get.
And so finally, I will check ourselves a little bit. You don't think that we're being hysterical? There are a lot of people, as you pointed out as well, as we acknowledge, cancer, blindness, there are very good applications to this. There are people who say that we are being hysterical, that this is not a doomsday scenario. Any truth to that?
So I do think that these are good technologies and there's a lot of good they can do. So I'm not saying we don't need these. I am also a person who was a skeptic, okay, for a long time. It's like, we're making way too much of AI and so forth. And what people really need to understand is that there has literally been a huge phase shift in the capability of the technology. That's the kind of lesson number one, most important takeaway. Today's AI is not Siri, all right? Like, we have totally changed categories, and that's why we need to have a pause, get our arms around the magnitude of the capacity, and then proceed.
Well, Danielle Allen, you are such a great, it is your voice on this, not your son's voice, but your voice on this.
That's right, exactly.
Thank you so much for joining.
You never know, though. All right. Thank you, Jared. Take care.
You too. The majority of American colleges and universities were designed by and for straight white men. And despite more recent advancements in diversity and inclusion, as author Michael Jeffries points out in a new book, there is still a long way to go for marginalized college students. Black and Queer on Campus shines a light on the experiences of Black LGBTQ+ students from more than 24 colleges. Michael Jeffries joins me now. He is also a professor of American Studies and the Dean of Academic Affairs at Wellesley College. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm so curious what your interest was, for starters, in writing this book.
Well, I think there were a couple of things. One was it was just driven by my experience as a professor. You know, I have students from all walks of life, all backgrounds, and some of the conversations that I had had with them really kind of clued me into the things that they were dealing with as college students, with competing pressures from home, pressures on campus. And the Black and queer students I talked to, they were having, some of them at least, were having trouble like finding that perfect spot, that niche, when they arrived on campus. And the other big factor was the Black Lives Matter movement, which was founded by queer Black women. I interviewed these students during the Trump administration, so it was a time of great political upheaval. And I was interested as to whether these students kind of saw themselves as the leaders of a kind of political vanguard, given that the Black Lives Matter movement was started by queer Black folk. So those were kind of the two things that really piqued my interest initially.
Which is a lot of responsibility for a young person to bear in any regard, let alone whether or not they want to be publicly outward about who they are. So how does that break down?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you said it exactly right. It's a huge responsibility, and what I found in the book is there's a tremendous diversity among these students. Some students really do think of themselves as politically radical, as people who are politically engaged, who take a great deal of responsibility, not only for themselves, but for the communities that they belong to. Other students are just trying to lead more ordinary lives as college students, right? They're just trying to get used to being away from home, making new friends, finding the studies that they're interested in school. And they don't want to be bothered, honestly. They have a hard time paying attention to the news and being that engaged with politics. So there was a huge range.
Another level of responsibility, perhaps, this term fly and fabulous, which could come out of entertainment culture. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about Black queer fabulousness, we're talking about an unapologetic and very outward, sort of outgoing, extroverted performance of gender, right? And we can think about people like RuPaul or Billy Porter, queer Black celebrities who sort of present themselves in that way. And that's a really important source of resistance and joy for queer Black folk. Having said that, it is not the only way that queer Black folk live their lives. So what I do in the book is give the students a chance to describe themselves on their own terms without falling back on some of those more widely recognizable stereotypes. And again, what you find is some students who really embrace that style of life and other students who are just more quiet and more introverted. And showing that range, I think, is really valuable.
For those quiet, introverted kids, is there a pressure that, or an expectation that if you're going to be part of the LGBTQ community, then you have to have the fabulousness of Billy Porter or RuPaul?
No, I really don't. You know, it's a great question. I really don't think there is. I think that for so many of these students, they're on a journey. It's a gradual process of coming into the life. And what they find when they get to campus is once they find a group of queer Black students who have been through some of the same things, these are generally very accepting collectives of folk with a great deal of latitude into kind of how you style yourself, the kinds of things you're into. So there's really not that kind of internal pressure from the LGBT community to be a certain type of queer.
You address there's a stereotype that exists about the Black community, and that is that the Black community is far less tolerant of LGBTQ issues. How did you see that within the students you spoke to?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's really important to talk about this because often when we talk about stereotypes of Black homophobia becomes the scapegoat for all of the institutional forces of homophobia or transphobia that are really the root cause, right? So when we look at the legal history of homophobia in this country, the fact that queerness was designated as a medical illness until the 1970s, right? Those are the real underlying reasons for homophobia, and yet when we turn our attention to Black people as the sort of flag carriers for homophobia, we can miss that history. Now, having said that, there are real issues within Black communities when it comes to homophobia. Some of them are tied to experiences within Black churches, where you have a long-standing tradition of allowance for queerness when it comes to the music director or the choir. But when you look at the pulpit, the things that you hear coming off the pulpit are not so accepting. So the students in the book really had to wrestle with so many of those things coming up, right? Some mixed messages from within their family, within their religious communities, and then also just kind of more blatant examples of homophobia and transphobia that they had to overcome as young people.
So for students coming out of these circumstances, how are they selecting colleges? How are they trying to create those communities to find inclusivity?
Yeah, you know, I thought that when I spoke with them, I would have heard more about students looking specifically for visible LGBT communities when they were visiting colleges, sort of as prospective students. But what I heard were the considerations were pretty much the same that we might expect for any student visiting college. Things like geography, the prestige of the school, the financial aid they were being offered. Those were like the first three things that they talked about, right? Because that is the reality for students trying to make a college selection. And then when they got to campus, they were picking up on subtle cues, especially around Black diversity. So even if it wasn't around LGBTQ visibility, it was, is there a range of Black folk here so I can find my own niche?
And then once they get there, you know this well, you're a college administrator. Where are we in terms of the support, in terms of the inclusivity? You think about this, this is actually something that's only been talked about probably loudly over the last 10 years, more openly over the last 20 years. That's not a long time. Yeah,
I mean, I think when it comes to inclusion with respect to LGBTQ plus students, this really was in the literature, in the studies, a late 20th century phenomenon. So even if you want to go back 20 years and be generous, that's really when we started thinking about this population and how we can support them when they're on the campus. And we have a long way to go, honestly, especially when it comes to queer Black folk and queer people of color. Because first of all, there aren't so many adult role models on campus that these students can look to and say, you know, I can imagine myself being someone like them when I grow up, when I graduate college. Secondly, when you look at LGBTQ student organizations, the leadership of those organizations at many of the campuses I visited were composed of white students. And those students, it's not that they were insensitive or outwardly racist, but they didn't often prioritize the intersection of racism and homophobia or racism and transphobia when setting the agenda for that student organization. So if you're a queer Black student at one of these places, you don't feel like your whole self is being spoken to in some of these social situations or in some of the situations where these groups are doing advocacy work. So there's a long way to go.
So finally, if you were to write a coda to your book today, because you started out the interview by saying that you interviewed these students during the Trump era when so much hate was being spewed, not that it's not now, but what's the level of optimism that you see among these students? Yeah,
I think it's mixed, honestly. I mean, I spoke with some students who told me, you know, what a discouraging time it had been, who told me that they were really losing faith in their neighbors because, again, as you just said, we were seeing expressions of really toxic hate just out in the open when you think about the terrorism at Charlottesville, for example, and so many other places. So there were many students who were like, you know, I don't know where we're going. I don't know how much hope I have left. But then there were others who were really trying to live beyond the moment and look at the long history of the struggle for not only Black liberation, but LGBTQ liberation in this country. And they look at that long history and they say, you know what? It has to get better. We've been here. We're not going anywhere, and there'll be more of us in the future. And the future, when you think about it that way, was very bright.
Well, as all the historians say the same, and at least as your book shows, they can talk about it too. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
The book again is Black and Queer on Campus. Next up, Broadway has barreled into Boston with the hit Sondheim musical Into the Woods. After a wildly popular 6-month run in New York, much of the Broadway cast decided to take the show on the road for a national tour. That includes Tony Award-winning actor Gavin Creel, who works double time in the musical, performing now at the Emerson Colonial Theater as both the Wolf and Cinderella's oh-so-immodest prince.
Am I not sensitive, clever, well-mannered, considerate, passionate, charming, as kind as I'm handsome, an heir to a throne?
You are everything maidens could wish for.
Then why no?
Do I know?
The girl must be mad.
And Gavin Creel joins me now. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm never going to get used to watching that, ever.
Well,
it's nice to be here.
Let's talk about Stephen Sondheim and what he's done with Into the Woods, this musical. I mean, it was so clever of Stephen Sondheim writing the music and James Lapine the book about taking something that we all have access to, all of these great stories like Jack and the Beanstalk and Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella and so forth. But where does he take us beyond that?
You know, it's a question everybody asks is like, what is the relevance of this show? Why this show? Why now? And I have to say, Sondheim and Lapine, like you said, take something we all know that's sort of part of our heartbeat, how we grew up, how we learned how to treat one another through these fairy tales and these allegories, and they remind us that it's still life's lessons in our faces, but they do it with like a little bit of a wicked adult twist, you know, it's a little spin of the mustache and just reminding us that Jack wasn't that good of a kid. He was a little bit of I can't say it without saying a curse word. He was just a little bit off.
Well, he was a murderer is what he was.
Yes, he was. He was, okay, yeah, there he was. He was a murderer, he was the thief. Little Red is ravenous in her own way, and I think the wolf was a victim. I know it's my character, so I play it. But it's just neat how they took these stories and made them into something that reminded us that they are still applicable to even today.
Well, I want to ask you about playing the wolf in a moment, but first of all, we just saw you, one of your songs in the show, and the complexity of singing Sondheim, all of those words, consonants, are not your friend, are they? He was so mathematical.
No. The number of times that I have like gone up on lyrics or mixed them up, I'm embarrassed to say is many. But Sondheim writes in a way that makes you want to re-engage each time you sing it. And it's like Shakespeare in that way, that there's always more to find. There's always, you can go deeper and deeper. And I've been doing the show now for, 250 times at this point, and it still surprises me. And I think it's neat because each audience is different. So each audience that we have at Emerson Colonial, it's just this new discovery. We're opening up this gift each time. And I have to be reminded, like, dig into those words because there's a lot of them and people want to hear them. That's what's so great about our production, I think, is we have the entire orchestra sitting on stage with us. We have this entire beautiful cast that is there making the words sit front and center. And we keep hearing from people, I could understand everything you were saying, and I got the show in such a way that I've never understood it before. So it's pretty special.
Yeah, I certainly count myself in that category. Going back to you playing the wolf, what are the mental calisthenics involved in playing two very different characters, the wolf and Cinderella's prince, within 20 minutes of each other on stage?
Yeah, it's pretty quick. We have a little quick change between when the wolf goes to his demise. I won't give it away. Everybody knows he dies. And then I switch very quickly into a full, obviously my hair is blue in real life, but I have a full wig change, full costume change. Shout out to Sophie Lynn and my wonderful dresser here in town, Erica. It's a team effort, and it's a lot of fun. As far as the characters go, I really enjoy physical approach to every part I play as an actor. I love approaching it physically. So the wolf is hunched and hungry, and the prince is very upright and regal, and it's really fun. And Andrea Hood designed 2 incredible costumes, so I just kind of put the costumes on and let them do the work.
Well, I want to ask you about another project you're working on. This is your own. It's called Walking Through, that you're developing. I think it's so...
Walk On Through, it's called.
Oh, sorry, Walk On Through.
Yeah.
In discovering art, for the first time at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this is something that you were able to work on during the pandemic and downtime. I know it had started before that. Perhaps we'll even see it here in Boston at some point. But what was that experience to discover the art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York?
You know, I have to say it's in the show, but it's an embarrassing admission to be, my early 40s and having never stepped foot in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But I just grew up with a challenged attention span, and I wasn't well versed in fine art and art education. And I was approached to possibly make a piece of theater in association with the art at the museum. So I literally just went in and started walking around and taking notes at anything. I just went, huh, or wow. And over about 3 years, I have created a piece that sort of examines art and life and love and loss and loneliness through about 40 different pieces of art in the museum. And I'm really excited to share it with the world. We're hopefully going to have a production in the fall in New York and then expand it from there and hopefully be able to bring it around the world. I just am really excited to share it with everyone.
Does that exposure to the visual arts, has that changed who you are as a performing artist?
That's a great question. Yes, I think so. When I was in acting school, they used to say, go to a museum and try to find art that the essence of which speaks to the character you're going to play. And we would go to like the library and go through pictures and photographs and try to find things that help bring the character to life. But since I spent so much time at the Met and really had a life-changing experience there, I think I do see artistic expression kind of everywhere now. It's like the museum. I always said the show Walk On Through is the Met is to the world as me as a middle-aged man who's like having this midlife crisis and going, where do I fit here? I've had this amazing career and this unbelievable luck, but I don't really know where I fit in this building. And I realized, it's not just the building, it's kind of like my life. At this moment, I don't really know where I fit. And I thought I had it all figured out. And the healing nature of art in that I just sort of saw all these names crossing spans of time and saying like, I'm here too, and you're going to be okay. I found it very affirming.
Well, it's really surprising to hear you say that, especially after you had won the Tony for Hello,
Yeah.
Dolly, and one might assume you had already moved to this height of your career. Actually, that was just a way of me to segue to ask if Bette Midler is really the divine Miss M after your experience working with her.
The most divine, the hardest working, the funniest, the driest, and just constantly futzing with every beat, wanting to make things better, wanting to like dig deeper. She never did the show the same way twice. She would find a big laugh and the next night do it completely different to see what else she could find. I loved working with her.
Well, Gavin Creel, and it's fabulous to watch you in this show. It is just glorious. Congratulations, and thank you for being with us. My pleasure. Thank you very much. Into the Woods is running through Sunday at the Emerson Colonial Theater. For more information, head to emersoncolonialtheater.com. Well, that's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Jared Bowen. Thanks for joining us.
Tonight's about Joni.